The buzzer for room 412 had been broken for a week, and that was the only reason anyone heard the man in it crying. It was past 2 in the morning on the medical floor at Halstead Memorial, and the night had already taken everything Daria Pruitt had to give. She had 2 patients on the far end who needed turning, a call light blinking down the hall, and a charting backlog that would keep her past the end of her shift without pay. She was 38 years old, a per diem night nurse with 11 years behind her badge, and not one of them easy. Her feet hurt in a way that had stopped being a complaint and become a fact, and she heard him. She was not assigned to 412. The man in that bed was a transfer from another floor, an admission with no family on file, a do not resuscitate order, and a chart that said comfort care only. The day staff had a name for patients like him when they thought no one was listening. Unbefriended. It meant alone. It meant nobody was coming. Daria pushed the door open and found an old man with thin white hair and skin gone the color of paper, gripping the bed rail like it was the edge of something he was about to fall off of. His eyes were wide and wet and afraid. He was not crying for help. He was crying the way people cry when they have run out of everyone, and the sound is just the body grieving itself in advance. She did not say the things nurses are trained to say. She pulled the hard plastic chair to the side of the bed, sat down, and took his hand in both of hers. That is where the story turns, though no one in that room knew it yet. Not him. Not her. She had no idea whose hand she was holding, and she would not find out for 2 more years. His name, according to the whiteboard, was Mr. Abernathy. He could not speak much by then. The cancer had moved into his bones, and his breath came in short, borrowed pulls. He could squeeze her fingers, though, and he did. Every time she started to think he had drifted off and tried to slip her hand away to check on her other patients. Each time, that thin grip tightened. Stay. And so she stayed. She charted from the chair, she balanced the laptop on the rolling table and typed with one hand because the other one was busy, and she would not give it back. She answered the one call light down the hall by catching the float aide, a young woman named Camille, in the corridor and asking her quietly to take the far rooms for an hour. Camille looked at the closed door of 412 and at Daria's face and understood without being told, and she nodded and went. Daria broke a rule, maybe 2. There are rules about where a nurse is supposed to be and how her time is supposed to be spent, and none of them have a line for the patient nobody is coming for. And through the worst hours of that long night, the ones that come between 3 and 5 when the hospital goes quiet, as a held breath, Daria talked to a dying man she had never met as if he were her own kin. She told him about her boy Theron, who was 9, and obsessed with anything that had a wing, who could name more birds than his teacher, and wanted to be a pilot or a paleontologist depending on the week. She told him she had a long drive home and a lawn chair on a 3rd-floor balcony where she liked to sit when the building finally went quiet. She told him the rain was supposed to come in by morning, that the forecast had said so, that he might hear it on the window if he held on that long. She did not promise him anything she could not give. She did not tell him it would be all right, because she did not lie to dying people. She told him he was not alone, and she said it enough times, in enough different ways, that somewhere around 4 o'clock he stopped fighting the bed rail and let his hand go soft in hers. His breathing changed. The fear went out of his face by degrees the way a fever breaks, and what was left underneath it was just an old man, tired, being kept company. He died at 5:40, a half hour before the day shift came on, with his hands still inside both of hers and the grey light just starting at the window. She washed her hands, she filled out the paperwork the death of a stranger requires. She went home, made her son breakfast, and slept 4 hours before she had to be back. She did not tell anyone what she had done, because to her, it was not a thing that had been done. It was just the only thing there was to do. She did not know that Mr. Abernathy's first name was Elias Crane Abernathy. She did not know that he had built and sold 3 companies. She did not know that the man with no family on file had a great deal of family, and that they had simply stopped coming. She did not know that somewhere in a glass tower across the city there was a sealed will, and that her name was not in it, and that this fact would one day matter more than almost anything. She only knew that a man had been afraid, and then he was not, and that she had been the one sitting there when it happened. 2 years is a long time when you are counting it in double shifts. In those 2 years, Daria's life got harder in the small, grinding ways that working lives get harder. The hospital reorganized the way hospitals do, with a memo and a town hall and a promise that the changes would make everyone's job easier, after which everyone's job got harder. Her per diem hours were cut. The shifts that used to be hers went to travelers who cost the hospital more and knew the floor less. And she trained them, because that was the kind of nurse she was, and then watched them work the hours she needed. A new charge nurse named Brett Holloway came onto the night rotation, a man in his early 40s who confused volume with competence and treated the senior nurses under him like an inconvenience he had inherited. He had opinions about everyone and a clipboard he carried like a badge of office. He wrote Daria up for a call button in another room that had failed 3 times, a failure she had reported in writing on each occasion as if the equipment were her fault and not the thing she had flagged. He wrote her up for clocking out late on the charting. He refused to give her the staffing to finish on time. He told her once in the med room with the door open so it carried down the hall to the station where the younger nurses were pretending not to listen, that maybe nursing had passed her by, that maybe she should think about whether she still had what the floor needed, that there was no shame in stepping aside for people with fresher training. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She finished her shift, drove home in the dark, and sat in the parked car outside her apartment building for a few minutes before she went up, because Theron was 11 now and she did not want him to see her come in, looking the way she felt. Money was the thing that never let go. Rent went up $40, then $60. Theron needed shoes again because 11-year-old feet do not care about a budget, and the old pair had a hole worn through the canvas that he tried to hide from her by keeping that foot tucked under the chair at dinner. She saw it anyway. Mothers see it anyway. There was a stretch in the winter where Daria paid the electric bill in 2 halves and kept the heat at 62 and told her son she liked it cool, that it was good for sleeping, and she wore her coat in the kitchen while she made his breakfast and took it off before he came in so he would not ask. She skipped lunch on the day she worked and told the break room nurses she was not hungry. She skipped the parking garage that cost $12 a shift and walked the 4 blocks from the free lot in the dark, keys laced between her fingers the way her mother had taught her. She did the math on everything. She knew to the dollar what was in the account and what was leaving it, when. And the math was always close, and being always close, month after month after month, is its own kind of exhaustion, the kind that does not show up in a mirror but settles in behind the eyes and stays. She did not complain about it, not to Theron, not to the few friends she had time for. She had grown up watching her own mother do this same arithmetic at this same kitchen table, and she had promised herself her boy would not feel the cold of it the way she had. So she carried it where he could not see, and she got up the next day and did it again. Through all of it, she kept doing the work the way she had always done it. She held hands. She learned which patients were scared of the dark and which ones were scared of the quiet, and she learned the difference. Because they are not the same fear, and they do not want the same thing. For the ones scared of the dark, she left the bathroom light on and the door cracked. For the ones scared of the quiet, she talked about nothing, about the weather and her son and the birds he loved, until they could sleep. There was a man that first winter who had no one, a retired bus driver named Mr. Okafor, and she sat with him through the night. He turned a corner and lived, and he cried and thanked her, and she told him to go on and rest. There was a woman in the spring with 3 grown children who never came, and Daria held her phone up to her ear and let her leave them a message. None of them returned, and stayed until it was over. She sat with the ones nobody came for because she had learned by then that those patients were not rare, that the hospital was full of people whose phones never rang, whose charts had a blank where a next of kin should be, who arrived alone and were going to leave that way unless somebody pulled up a chair. She did it on her own time, off the clock, in the minutes. Brett Holloway could not bill or dock or write up. She never connected any of it to the old man from room 412. She had honestly half forgotten his name. To her, it was not a story she was in. It was just the work, the part of it that did not show up on any report. The part she had decided long ago was the actual point of the rest. The world had not forgotten hers, though. It just had not gotten around to telling her yet. The call came on a Tuesday in October on a number she did not recognize, and she almost let it go to voicemail because unknown numbers in her life meant collections. The voice on the other end was careful and even. It belonged to a woman named Priya Sandoval, and she said she was an attorney with a firm called Linden and Marsh, and she asked, very politely, whether she was speaking with Daria Pruitt, who had worked the night shift at Halstead Memorial. Daria's stomach dropped, because in her experience, a lawyer looking for a nurse meant one thing, and that thing was a lawsuit. She gripped the phone and said yes, that was her, and braced. What the lawyer said instead was this. 2 years ago, on a night in spring, Daria had sat with a patient named Elias Abernathy until he passed. She, Priya Sandoval, had spent 11 months trying to find the nurse who did that. And she had finally found her, and she needed to see her because Mr. Abernathy had left instructions, and those instructions had her name on them. Daria sat down on the edge of her bed. She made the lawyer say it twice. Even then it did not land as good news. It landed as a thing she did not understand, a door opening onto a room she could not see into. She remembered the man. She remembered the thin grip and the grey light. She had not known his money, had not known his name, was a name people in this city recognized. She said, slowly, that she did not understand what any of this had to do with her. And Priya Sandoval said, gently, that she would explain everything in person, but that Daria should know one thing going in. There were people who were going to say she had done something wrong, and she had not. And that was why they needed to talk. Here is the part that matters, and it is the part that turns a kindness into a fight. Elias Abernathy had not left Daria a thing in his original will. That will was old, written years before any of this, and it divided his estate among a foundation, a few charities, and a niece named Vivian Cross, the only relative who had stayed close enough to be in the document at all. Vivian was a poised, expensively dressed woman in her 50s who ran a design firm and had spent years as the assumed heir, the one who would come into the bulk of what Elias built. She was not a cartoon. She had loved her uncle in the way some people love, a relative chiefly for what he represents, and she had also stopped visiting him in his last year, and she had told herself 100 soft reasons why. There was, however, a second document. In the last weeks of his life, after the night on the medical floor, Elias Abernathy had asked Priya Sandoval to come to his bedside, and he had dictated a change. He had remembered something. Not a name, because he never got the nurse's name. He remembered 2 hands around his and a voice telling him it was going to rain, and that he was not alone. He told his lawyer that on the worst night of his life, a black night nurse at Halstead had stayed with him when there was nothing in it for her, no family watching, no tip, no thank you coming, and that he had decided in that bed that whoever she was, she understood something most of the people in his will did not. He directed that a portion of his estate, a specific and not small portion, be given to her. He could not name her. So he described her, and he described the night, and he instructed his lawyer to find her. The portion was $1.5 million, and Vivian Cross was contesting it. That was the fight. Vivian had her own lawyer, a sharp and well-paid man named Garrett Voss, and the position they took was not subtle. A dying, medicated, 90-year-old man, they argued, alone and frightened, had been worked on. A nurse, with access to him in his most vulnerable hours, had inserted herself, had made herself memorable on purpose, had cultivated a connection precisely so that a confused old man would carve out a fortune for a stranger over his own blood. They called it undue influence. They filed to have the codicil thrown out. And in the filing, in black and white, they called Daria Pruitt by a word that made her hands go cold when Priya read it to her. Predatory. Daria put the phone down on her knee and looked at the wall of her small apartment for a long moment. She thought about the chair she had pulled up. She thought about how she had not even known his name. And she understood, sitting there, that the money was not the thing that was about to be tested. Her name was. She almost walked away. People forget that part when they hear how it ends. There was a Tuesday and then a Wednesday where Daria seriously considered telling the lawyer to keep it, to give it to the niece, to leave her out of it entirely because $1.5 million was not worth being called predatory in a courtroom by a man in a good suit. She had a son, she had a job that was already shaky, she had a reputation that in her world was the only collateral she owned. To fight was to risk all of it on a stranger's gratitude. It was Theron of all people who set her straight, though he did not know he was doing it. He was at the kitchen table doing homework, and he asked her out of nowhere why she looked sad, and she said something about work. And he said, with the flat certainty of 11, that she should just tell them the truth, because the truth was easy when you didn't do anything wrong. He went back to his fractions. He had no idea he had just said the only thing that mattered. She called Priya Sandoval back the next morning and said she would not be giving anything away, not the money, and not, she said her name. They could call her what they wanted in a filing. She knew what she had done. She would come and say so, under oath, to anyone who wanted to hear it. The lawyer was quiet a moment, and then she said something Daria would hold on to through the months that followed. She said she had read the nursing notes from that night, the ones Daria had charted from the hard plastic chair at 3 in the morning, and that they were the cleanest, most careful record she had seen in 20 years of doing this work. Daria had no idea. The lawyer said how strong her own ground was. The very thing Brett Holloway wrote her up for, the late clockouts, the obsessive charting, the refusal to cut a corner, was about to become the wall that held. The case did not move quickly. These things never do. There were months of what the lawyers called discovery, which in plain terms meant that Vivian Cross's side went looking for anything they could use, and Daria's whole working life was pulled out into the light and examined for cracks. Garrett Voss subpoenaed her personnel file. He found the write-ups Brett Holloway had stacked up, and he held them up like evidence. A nurse with a documented pattern of problems, a nurse her own supervisor had questioned the competence of. He found the cut hours and tried to spin them into a motive, a woman who was desperate for money, who had every reason to scheme. He took her deposition in a glass conference room downtown and spent 4 hours trying to get her to contradict herself, asking the same questions in 11 different shapes, watching for the seam where her story might come apart. It did not come apart because it was not a story. She sat in the glass conference room in her one good blazer with a cup of water she did not drink, and she answered every question in the same plain voice. She told him the buzzer in that room had been broken, and that was the only reason she heard the man at all. She told him she was not assigned to the room, that he had been a transfer with no one listed to call, that nobody on the floor had wanted that admission because there was nothing to do for him but wait. She told him she did not know who the man was, did not know he had a dime, did not learn his full name until a lawyer called her 2 years later. She told him she had charted from the chair because she did not want to leave the patient. And when Voss asked whether it was normal to chart from a bedside, she said it was normal to chart wherever you were standing when you had a free hand, and that she had not had a free hand. He circled. He came back to the same ground from new angles, asking whether she made a habit of staying with patients off the clock, whether she understood how that might look, whether she had ever received money or gifts from a patient or a patient's family. She said no, never, not once in 11 years. He asked whether she had told the man it was going to rain. She said she had. He asked why. She said because the forecast said it would, and because it was a kind thing to say to a person who was frightened of the dark, a thing to hold on to, something ordinary and outside the room to think about. Voss let a silence sit there, the kind lawyers use, and Daria let it sit too. She had sat through longer silences with dying men. A quiet conference room did not frighten her. When Voss asked her finally in the practiced, wounded tone of a man springing a trap, why she had not reported that a patient seemed to be growing attached to her, why she had not flagged it to a supervisor or stepped back, she looked at him across the long table and said that the man had been dying, and that growing attached to the person holding your hand while you die is not a crime, and that if it were, every good nurse in that hospital would be guilty of it, herself most of all. Voss did not have a follow-up to that. He looked at his notes and asked the court reporter to mark the time and call the recess. The reporter typed Daria's answer into the record, and it sat there plain and unmovable, black letters on a white page, and it would matter later more than anyone in that room yet knew. An active opponent, though, does not lose on a single good line. Vivian Cross's side had a real case to build, and they built it. Voss's strategy was to drown the codicil in doubt, and his strongest weapon was the simplest one. Elias Abernathy had been medicated, he had been in pain, he had been 90. If Voss could establish that the old man was not of sound mind when he changed his will, the whole thing collapsed and Daria's character would not matter at all. So he went and found a physician, a credentialed and persuasive expert named Dr. Lenorcase, who reviewed the records and prepared to testify that a patient in Elias's condition, on the medications in his chart, could not have formed the clear, durable intention the law required. It was a clean attack. It did not call Daria a thief. It called Elias incompetent and let her bequest die of his incapacity. For a while, it looked like it might work. There was a hearing in the winter where Dr. Case laid it out, dosage by dosage, in the calm authoritative voice that juries and judges are trained their whole lives to trust. She had charts. She had a pointer and a screen and a manner that made the cruelty of what she was doing sound like simple medicine. She explained that the combination of opioids and the man's age and the progression of the disease into his brain made sustained, clear intention all but impossible, that a patient in that state might say many things and mean none of them, might reach for any comfort and call it love. She never once said Daria's name with contempt. She did not have to. She was not there to attack the nurse. She was there to make the old man too foggy to have meant her, and that was worse because it was quieter, and it sounded reasonable. And reasonable is what wins in rooms like that. The room got very quiet. Daria sat in the back in the one good blazer she owned and felt the ground she had been told was strong start to move under her. She looked at the back of Vivian Cross's expensive haircut 3 rows ahead and thought about how strange it was that a woman who had stopped visiting could pay a doctor to prove the visits would not have counted anyway. Priya Sandoval's face did not change. Her pen, though, had stopped moving on her legal pad, and Daria had learned by then to read the small tells of the people fighting for her, and a still pen in Priya's hand was not a good sign. That was the black part of it, the stretch, where it really did look. Lost Vivian's expert was good. The codicil was hanging by the thread of a dead man's clarity, and dead men cannot take the stand to prove they meant it. Except that Elias Abernathy, it turned out, had thought of that himself. This is the thing. Priya Sandoval had been holding the thing she had not led with because she was a careful lawyer and she wanted it to land when it would land hardest, after the other side had committed all the way to the story that the old man's mind was gone. On the day Elias dictated the change to his will, he had been lucid enough to anticipate exactly this fight. He had run companies for 40 years. He knew how money makes people behave when someone dies, and he knew his niece, and he had told his lawyer plainly that Vivian would come after it, that she would say he had gone soft in the head, that she would hire someone with letters after their name to say his last clear act was a confusion, and he had refused, with what was left of him, to let that be the end of the story. So Priya had done what careful lawyers do when the client is dying and the stakes are high and the family is the kind of family his was. She had recorded it, with his full consent on the record, with a second attorney present in the room as a witness and a third reviewing afterward. She had set up a camera at the foot of the hospital bed and filmed Elias Abernathy, stating in his own failing voice who he was, what the date was, where he was and why, who the president was, what he owned down to the broad strokes and what he wanted done with it and exactly why. She had walked him slowly through every question a court would one day ask about a sound and disposing mind, the whole grim checklist, and he had answered every one of them patiently, between breaths, like a man signing his name carefully because he knew it was the last important thing he would sign. And then, unprompted, near the end, he had said the thing that turned the whole case. He said he could not give the nurse her name back because he had never learned it, and that this was the proof, not the problem. A schemer, he said, would have made sure he knew her name. A schemer would have made herself unforgettable. The woman who sat with him had been so little interested in being remembered that she had never once told him who she was. He had to be found by a description because she had asked for nothing, taken nothing, and left no trace but the memory of her hands. That, he said, looking into the camera with the last clear strength he had, was why he was sure. Not in spite of the fact that she was a stranger. Because of it, when that recording played in the courtroom, Vivian Cross did not look at the screen. She looked at her hands. The hearing did not end that day, but everything after it was downhill for the other side. Kayser testified that Elias could not have formed a clear intention, and now there was Elias on a screen, forming it with a precision that made the expert's confident dosages look like a chart misread for a man. Priya put Daria's charting notes side by side with the timeline and showed that the nurse who supposedly schemed had documented every minute in a way that left no room for the scheme to hide in. She called the float aide who had answered Daria's call lights that night, a young woman named Camille who testified, nervous and certain, that Daria had sent her to the other room specifically so she could stay with the dying man, that there had been nothing in it, that everybody on that floor knew Daria Pruitt was the nurse who sat with the ones nobody came for, and then Priya did the thing that finished it. She called Brett Holloway. Vivian's side had been so eager to use his write-ups that they had made him relevant, and Priya had subpoenaed the man who built them on the stand. Under questions that did not let him perform, Brett Holloway's pattern came apart. The write-up for the broken buzzer was for equipment Daria had reported as broken, with the report dated and filed. Priya put it on the screen. The write-up for late charting was for the very thoroughness that the other side's own subpoena had entered into evidence as the cleanest record the lawyer had seen in 20 years. Question by question, the supposed proof of Daria's incompetence revealed itself as proof of the opposite, and the man who had told her in an open medroom that nursing had passed her by sat in a witness chair and watched his own paper trail testify for the woman he had tried to bury under it. Daria did not gloat. She sat in the back row and watched a thing she had carried alone for 2 years be carried, finally, by other people, out loud, in the light, and she found that her face was wet. She had not noticed its start. She had spent 2 years bracing to defend herself and discovering that the defense was the truth, and the truth did not need her to raise her voice. It only needed her to have lived it, which she had every night, for 11 years. The judge took 3 weeks. Daria worked her shifts through those 3 weeks the way she had worked every other stretch of her life, because the rent was still due whatever a judge decided, and because the patients on her floor did not know or care that a courtroom across the city was deciding what her kindness had been worth. She turned the patients who needed turning. She sat with a woman who was frightened of the quiet. She drove home in the dark and did not let herself think about the number, because she had learned long ago that hoping for things you could not control was just borrowing grief at interest. When the ruling came, it was not loud. It arrived as a phone call from Priya, and then a document, calm and dry and final. It found that Elias Crane Abernathy had been of sound and disposing mind on the day he changed his will, that the codicil reflected his clear and considered intent, that there was no credible evidence of undue influence by anyone, and that the bequest to Daria Pruitt was valid and would be honoured in full. $1.5 million. The number that had been hanging over a glass conference room for the better part of a year, settled in 2 pages of plain judicial language that did not raise its voice either. The part Daria remembered, though, was not the number, and it was not the courtroom. It was the hallway after Vivian Cross was waiting by the elevators. Daria's first instinct was to walk the other way, because she had been called predatory by this woman's lawyer in a public filing, and she did not owe her a single soft word. Vivian stepped forward anyway, and up close, she did not look like an heiress who had lost a fortune. She looked like a woman who had lost something else and had only just understood what it was. She said she had watched the recording 4 times. She said she had stopped going to see her uncle in his last year because she could not stand the smell of the hospital and the sight of him shrinking, and that a stranger had done for him what his own family could not make itself do. She said she was sorry. Not for the money, for the word in the filing. She said she had let her lawyer call a good woman, a thing she was not, because it was easier than facing what it meant that the good woman was not her. Daria looked at her for a long moment. She did not lecture her. She did not have it in her to twist the knife, and she had never wanted the woman ruined, only the truth told. She said only that she hoped Vivian would go and sit with sometime, the way she wished she had sat with Elias. Then she pressed the elevator button, and the two of them rode down in a silence that was, by the end of it, almost gentle, and they parted in the lobby and did not see each other again. The money changed the shape of Daria's days, but it did not change Daria, and that is the part she is proudest of. She paid off the apartment debt first, the patched-together bills and the rent she had split in half through the winter, the small loans from a cousin that she had never let herself forget she owed. She bought Theron the shoes, 2 pairs, and watched him try not to look too pleased about it. And then, with a kind of disbelief that took weeks to wear off, she signed for a small house with a yard, the first home of her own she had ever put her name on, in a quiet neighborhood across town with a tree out front that turned gold in October. The first night in it, she walked from room to room with the lights off, just feeling the space. And she stood in the kitchen a long time, because it was a kitchen where she would never have to wear her coat. She set aside what her boy would need for college, and did not touch it, would not touch it, told the bank to make it hard for her to touch it. He gave a chunk, quietly, to the hospital's program for patients who came in with no one to call, the ones who arrive alone and would otherwise leave that way, and she insisted on one condition before she signed the gift over. It had to pay for nurses to be allowed the time to sit on the clock with the ones who are dying alone, so that the next Daria would not have to break a rule to do it, so that holding a stranger's hand at 3 in the morning would be part of the job and not a thing stolen from the corners of a shift. She did not put her name on it. The administrator who took the gift asked what they should call the fund, and she thought about it and said to call it the night chair, and would not explain why, and the woman wrote it down. She did not quit nursing. People assumed she would, and she understood why, but they had misunderstood what the work was to her. She did move to days, and she did finally have the standing to push back when a charge nurse confused volume with competence, and Brett Holloway, as it happened, did not last long on the unit, after a deposition in which his own write-ups came apart in front of the people he reported to. She did not pull a single string to make that happen. His paper trail did the work, the same way hers had. There is a chair in Daria Pruitt's new living room, an old hard plastic thing she went out of her way to keep, that does not match anything else in the room. Theron asked her once why she did not throw it out. She told him it was the kind of chair you pull up to a bed. He did not really understand, and she did not explain, because some things you carry are not for explaining. She kept it by the window, where the morning light comes in grey before it goes gold, the way it had come in that last hour at Halstead, and sometimes in the early quiet before her son woke up, she sat in it with her coffee and her 2 hands wrapped around the warm cup, and she thought about a frightened man whose name she never learned in the room. And she was glad every single time that the buzzer had been broken. She had held a stranger's hand all night, because no one else would. She never asked to be paid for it. The man she comforted made sure, before he went, that the world would one day know what she was. And when the world tried to call her something else, the truth she had charted from a plastic chair at 3 in the morning stood up in a courtroom and spoke for her, louder than any lawyer could. Kindness done in the dark, where no one is watching, has a way of keeping its own quiet records. Elias Abernathy kept his on a recording and a single changed page. Daria Pruitt kept hers in 11 years of nursing notes and the worn shape of a chair she would not give up. And the morning light came in grey, and then it came in gold, and a good woman who had been overlooked her whole working life sat in her own house, on her own land, paid in full, and finally, after all of it, at rest.